Street boys singing a Dean Martin song when suddenly Dean Martin himself showed up, the voice on the cold corner. The winter wind cut through the narrow downtown street like a blade, sliding between old brick buildings and rattling loose signs above shuttered shops. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin, but seeped into bone, settling deep, lingering there as if it planned to stay forever. People hurried past with collars raised, hands buried in pockets, eyes fixed forward. No one wanted to meet anyone else's gaze. No one wanted to see too much. And no one, at first, truly noticed the boy standing beside a flickering street lamp with a battered guitar and a voice far bigger than his thin, shaking body. He couldn't have been more than 13, maybe 14. His coat was 2 sizes too big, its elbows frayed, its zipper broken, so he held it closed with one hand while the other rested lightly on the guitar strings. His shoes were old, the soles thinning, and his breath fogged the air in short, uneven bursts. But when he opened his mouth, the street itself seemed to pause. He was singing a Dean Martin song, not loudly, not to demand attention. He sang the way someone sings when they are alone, even when surrounded by hundreds of strangers. Soft, careful, as if the song were something fragile that could break if he pushed it too hard. His voice wasn't perfect. It cracked sometimes, but inside it lived something rare, a warmth that didn't belong to the cold, a tenderness that didn't belong to the street, a kind of longing that felt far too old for a boy his age. When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, a woman slowed. Then a man. Then another. People didn't stop because he was good. They stopped because he was real. Because there was something in the way he sang that felt like memory. Like kitchens lit at night. Like radios playing softly while someone cooked. Like laughter from another lifetime. His small, shaking fingers brushed the strings, giving the melody just enough shape to carry his voice forward. Into the moving crowd, the boy's name was Eli. He didn't know why he kept choosing Dean Martin songs. He only knew that when he sang them, his chest hurt less. That when he sang them, he could almost pretend he wasn't standing on a freezing street corner with nowhere to go. When the night finally won, his mother used to hum these songs. Not well. Never on key, but she loved them. She loved how smooth they sounded. How gentle. How they made the world feel less sharp. On the nights when the apartment lights were still on, and the shouting from the neighboring rooms hadn't started yet, she would sit on the edge of the couch and hum while brushing his hair back with her fingers, telling him stories about a time when music came from radios instead of phones, and singers sounded like they were smiling even when they were sad. She said, his voice sounded like a warm coat. Eli once whispered to himself, like something you could put on when the world was cold. That was before the hospital, before the empty apartment, before the nights when dinner was whatever he could afford with what? Strangers dropped into a cracked plastic cup, so he sang, not for money. Not really. He sang because when he sang, he wasn't invisible. When he sang, he wasn't just another small figure the city swallowed whole. When he sang, he existed. A few coins hit the cup. $1. Someone nodded. Someone smiled. Someone filmed for 10 seconds and moved on. The street resumed its flow, but the small circle of quiet around him remained. Like a bubble, the noise couldn't quite break. Eli closed his eyes on the chorus. That's amor. And he didn't see the man who had stopped at the far edge of the crowd. He didn't see the tall figure in a long dark coat, standing very still, as if he'd been planted there by the sound itself. He didn't see the way the man's hands slowly curled at his sides. He didn't see the expression on the man's face, because if he had, he might have been too afraid to keep singing. The man was older, silver-haired, his posture relaxed but alert. The way someone stands when they've spent a lifetime on stages and learned how to hold themselves even when they aren't on one. His eyes were hidden behind lightly tinted glasses, but behind them, something was happening that almost no one around him could. Recognition, not of the boy, of the voice, of the song, of the feeling, because it wasn't often, in all his years, that Dean Martin heard someone sing one of his songs like that, not as a performance, but as a confession. Dean had been walking back from a small recording session. No press, No entourage. No stage lights. Just a coat, a hat, and the simple pleasure of disappearing into a city where most people no longer expected to see him. He liked the quiet days more now. The ordinary ones. The ones where he could listen instead of being listened to. And then he heard it at first. He thought it was a radio. Then he realized it was wrong. Radios didn't sound like that. They didn't shake. They didn't breathe. They didn't carry hurt inside the notes, so he followed the sound across one crosswalk. Then another, until he saw the boy under the street lamp, eyes closed, face pale from the cold, singing as if the world were both his enemy and his last. Friend, Dean stopped, and something deep in his chest shifted. The song wasn't being sung to entertain. It was being sung to survive. Dean had spent decades hearing his own voice played back to him through speakers, stages, films, tributes. He had heard it polished, remixed, imitated, but he hadn't heard it like this in a very long time. Stripped, unprotected, human. The boy's voice wavered at the end of a line. He swallowed, steadying himself before continuing. Not for the crowd. For himself, Dean took off his glasses. He needed to see this with his own eyes. People around him whispered, "Is that?" "No way." "It looks like..." But Dean didn't move forward. Not yet. He wanted to hear the whole thing. Eli finished the song with a breath that trembled, last chord fading into the cold air. For a second, no one clapped. It felt wrong to break something that fragile. Then slowly, someone did, then another. The small sound grew into something gentle but real. Eli opened his eyes. He gave a small, awkward nod the way people do when they don't quite believe they deserve what they're hearing. He bent to adjust the cup, more out of habit than hope. And that was when he finally looked up and saw the man standing only a few steps away. Not the coat. Not the height. The face. Eli's mind rejected it. First, because some faces don't belong on street corners. They belong on old album covers, on television screens, in memories his mother used to talk about. He blinked once. Twice. Dean. Martin met his eyes and smiled. Wasn't a stage smile. It wasn't the kind people practiced it. Was quiet and unmistakably kind. The street felt like it tilted. Eli's fingers slipped on the guitar neck. For a moment, he was sure he was dizzy from the cold, or hungry, or finally imagining things. Because there was no other explanation for why the man whose voice lived on old tapes and in his mother's humming was standing in front of him, looking at him as if he were the only person on the street. Dean spoke, not loudly, not to make a moment, just enough for the boy to hear. "That was beautiful, son." Eli didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dean took one slow step closer, then another. He could see now how thin the boy was, how the cold had colored his hands, how tightly he held the guitar, like it might disappear if he let go. "What's your name?" Dean asked gently. The boy swallowed. Eli. Dean nodded, as if committing it to something important. "I'm Dean." Eli let out a small, broken laugh before he could stop himself. "I know," he whispered. The crowd had gone quiet again. Phones rose. Whispers moved like wind through leaves, but Dean didn't look at them. His attention stayed exactly where it was. On the boy. "Who taught you that song?" Dean asked. Eli hesitated then. Very softly, "My mom." Something passed through Dean's eyes. "She loved your music," Eli added quickly, afraid the silence meant he'd said something wrong. She used to play it when things were better." Dean nodded again. "I'm glad," he said. And he meant more than the words carried. Eli's shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for the moment to end, because moments like this didn't belong to him. They were borrowed. And borrowed things always had to be given back. But Dean didn't turn away. Instead, he looked at the guitar. "Do you know any others?" he asked. Eli's voice came out smaller. "A few," Dean smiled. "Would you sing one more?" The boy hesitated. The cold bit deeper. His fingers hurt. His stomach twisted. But when Dean Martin asks you to sing, you sing. Eli nodded. He adjusted the strap, took a breath, and began again. This time, his voice didn't shake as much, because this time, he wasn't singing alone, and Dean Martin stood there, listening to his own song carried by a boy who had nothing in the world but a voice, a memory, and the courage to use both. And inside Dean, something old and heavy and almost forgotten was beginning to wake. The second song began more quietly than the first, not because Eli meant it to, but because something heavy had settled. In his chest, the street no longer felt like a street. The cold no longer felt like cold. The faces no longer felt like strangers. Everything had narrowed into a single, fragile tunnel between him and the man standing only a few feet away. Dean Martin. A name he had whispered as a child when his mother played old records. A voice he had grown up hearing in a tiny apartment when the world outside felt too loud. And now that same man stood under a trembling street lamp. Watching him as if this moment mattered, Eli's fingers brushed the strings again. The guitar answered softly, uncertain, like it too was afraid to disturb whatever invisible thing had formed between them. His voice followed. Not loud, not showy, but deeper this time, as if something inside him had unlocked. Everybody loves somebody sometime. The words moved across the street like warmth. Not fast, not sharp. They drifted, slow and steady, filling the spaces between people. A few more had stopped walking, then more. Someone on the far side of the road paused in the middle of a step and turned fully toward the sound. Even the traffic at the intersection seemed to thin, as if the city itself were leaning in. Dean did not move, but inside him, something did. It wasn't pride, it wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. He had sung this song thousands of times, on glowing stages, in packed halls. With orchestras behind him and lights above him and applause waiting at the end, he had sung it smiling. He had sung it tired. He had sung it because it was his job. He had sung it because people expected it. He had sung it because it was safe. He had never heard it like this. Eli wasn't singing about love the way adults sing about love. He was singing about the kind of love that disappears, the kind you lose before you are ready, the kind you don't yet have words for. Each line came out careful, almost guarded, as if he were carrying something breakable in his throat. And with every word, Dean felt himself being pulled further away from the man he was and closer to the boy he had once been. The one who had stood in small rooms. The one who had sung before he knew anyone was listening. The one who had believed, for a brief time, that music could keep people from leaving. Dean's hand lifted slightly without him realizing it, not to stop to join, but he didn't yet, because he wanted to hear how far. The boy could go on his own. Eli reached the chorus. His voice rose, just a little, and that was when it happened. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it wasn't planned, but it changed everything. Dean Martin began to sing at first. It was almost nothing, a breath shaped into tone, a harmony so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind slipping between buildings. A second voice rapping gently around the first. Eli felt it before he heard it. A warmth against his sound, Steadiness, something behind him, his fingers faltered on the strings. He turned his head slightly, and the voice grew clearer. Dean didn't step forward. He didn't take the stage. He didn't perform. He simply sang. Low, smooth, familiar. The street changed. People straightened, as if electricity had passed through the air. Phones rose higher. Someone near the front covered their mouth. A woman whispered something and began to cry without knowing why. The harmony slid perfectly beneath Eli's melody, lifting it, supporting it, never overpowering it. Two voices, one old, one young, one carrying a lifetime, one carrying almost nothing, and somehow, together, they made something whole. Eli's breath shook, but he kept going, because Dean Martin was singing with him, not instead of him. with him, the boy's voice wavered on a line. And instantly, without thought, Dean leaned into the harmony, steadying it. When Eli found his footing again, Dean softened, giving the space back. It was not a duet planned in a studio. It was not a performance rehearsed. It was instinct. The kind musicians only reach when they stop trying to be heard and start trying to listen. The song ended, and for a heartbeat, the street forgot what noise was. No applause, no talking, no movement, just breath. Then the sound came down like rain, not screaming, not chaos, something deeper. People clapped slowly at first, as if standing after something sacred. Then louder, then fuller. Someone shouted. Someone laughed through tears. A small circle of strangers had turned into a crowd, and a crowd had turned into witnesses. Eli stood frozen. The guitar hung against his chest. His hands no longer hurt. The cold had disappeared. His mind could not catch up with what had just happened. He had sung with Dean Martin, not in a dream, not on a screen. On a sidewalk, Dean turned fully toward him. Up close, Eli could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the gentleness there, the weight of years lived, and also something else. Respect. You didn't need me, Dean said quietly. Eli shook his head without meaning to. Yes, Dean continued softly. You did not. You were already carrying the song. Eli tried to speak. Nothing came. Dean glanced at the small cup near the boy's feet. The thin coat. The guitar that had known too many nights outdoors. How long have you been singing out here? He asked. A while, Eli finally managed. Dean waited. Since my mom, Eli said. He didn't finish. Dean didn't ask him to. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it without ceremony. Eli didn't know why he took it until he felt the wet on his face. He hadn't noticed himself crying. Do you have somewhere warm to go tonight? Dean asked. Eli hesitated. That was a dangerous question. It was the kind adults asked when they were about to walk away feeling better about themselves. The kind that came with no real answer. The kind he usually softened. But Dean wasn't. Looking at him like that, he was looking at him like someone who wanted the truth. Eli swallowed. Sometimes, he said. Dean nodded. Slowly, then, he did something no one expected. He took off his own coat. It was a good one, heavy-lined, the kind that kept winter where it belonged. He stepped forward and gently placed it around Eli's shoulders. The crowd murmured. Eli stiffened. I'm okay, he said quickly, trying to give it back. Dean shook his head once. You're not, he said kindly, and that's all right. The coat settled around Eli like a memory he hadn't had in years. Warmth, real warmth. Dean rested a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. You have something? He said. Not because of me. Not because of any song. You have it because you lived something and didn't let it take your voice with it. Eli looked down. I'm just singing, he whispered. Dean smiled. So was I, he said. Once. He glanced around at the people still watching, still filming, still whispering. Then back to Eli. Would you walk with me for a moment? He asked. Eli's heart stumbled. Double quotes. Where? Somewhere quieter, Dean said. I want to hear about you without the street listening. Boy hesitated. Every lesson he had learned out here told him to be careful. To guard moments. To not step into strangers. Worlds. But this wasn't just a stranger. And this wasn't just a moment. He nodded. Dean gestured gently down the block as they began to move. The crowd parted, not like fans, like people making space for something meaningful to pass. Eli walked beside Dean Martin. Wrapped in his coat, a guitar against his chest, the city suddenly feeling much larger and much smaller at the same time. He did not know that within the next hour, his life would begin to turn in a way he could not yet imagine. He did not know that someone was already calling a number, whispering what they had just witnessed. He did not know that. What? Started as a song on a cold corner was about to become a story the street would never forget. But Dean knew, because he had felt that turning before, and he recognized it. They walked only half a block before the city's noise began to loosen its grip. The glow of the main street faded behind them, replaced by a quieter side road where the buildings leaned closer together and the air felt heavier, as if it had been waiting to hear something real. A small cafe sat on the corner, its windows fogged from warmth inside, its yellow lights spilling onto the pavement like something soft and inviting. Dean paused there, not to go in, but to stand beneath its awning where the wind could not reach so easily. The sudden absence of cold felt almost shocking. Eli stood very still, wrapped in Dean's coat, unsure what he was allowed to do with his hands, his guitar, his eyes, his breath. Dean did not rush him. He leaned back slightly against the brick wall, the way someone does when they are not trying to impress anyone, only to stay. The street behind them still murmured, but it was distant now, like waves heard from far inside a building. For the first time since he had begun singing that evening, Eli felt as though he were not being watched. "What's your full name?" Dean asked gently. "Eli Carter." Dean repeated it once, quietly, like he was testing how it sounded in the air. "How old are you, Eli Carter?" 13. Dean nodded, though something in his eyes tightened. "And how long have you been out here?" Eli shifted his weight. He had learned that questions like that could be dangerous. They could turn into sympathy without action. They could turn into lectures. They could turn into promises people didn't keep a while, he said again. Dean studied him not as a fan, not as a celebrity, but as a man who had learned when a child was protecting something. "You don't owe me anything," Dean said quietly. "Not a story, not an explanation. But if you want to tell me, I'll listen." The words were simple. The way he said them was not. Eli's fingers tightened around the edge of the coat. The warmth against his skin felt unfamiliar, almost undeserved. He stared at a dark spot on the pavement for a long moment, as if something might rise up and tell the story for him. "My mom used to sing," he said finally. "Not like good, but she sang all the time." Dean did not interrupt. She worked late, cleaning offices mostly. Sometimes she was tired. Sometimes she was sad. But when she played those old songs, she sounded different, like she remembered who she was before everything got heavy. His voice faltered. He swallowed and continued. "She liked yours the best. She said you made sad things sound kind." Dean closed his eyes briefly. Eli went on, the words beginning to move now, as if something inside him had decided it was time. "When she got sick, we listened to them more. At night, when the apartment was quiet, she would hum, and I would try to sing with her, and she would laugh because I was always too loud." A small, broken smile crossed his face and vanished just as quickly. "She told me that if I ever felt alone, I should sing, because singing makes space around you. She said it pushes the dark back." Paused. She didn't get better. The sentence landed between them, heavy but not dramatic. Real. Final. Dean did not move. Eli stared harder at the ground. After she was gone, everything got quiet. Too quiet. "I stayed in the apartment at first. But then," he hesitated, the words not wanting to form. "Then there wasn't an apartment anymore, and there wasn't anyone to tell me when to stop being afraid." The streetlight buzzed faintly above them. "I started singing outside because when I sang, people looked at me like I was something. Not just in the way, not just there," he shrugged, a small, defeated motion. "Sometimes they gave me money. Sometimes they didn't. But sometimes they smiled. And that made it feel like she was still sort of around." Dean's jaw tightened. "How long have you been sleeping out here?" he asked. Eli's shoulders rose almost imperceptibly. "Some nights." Dean did not ask where. He already knew. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything Dean could not say out loud. Of years. Of stages. Of standing ovations. Of hotels. Of comfort. And now, of a boy who had lost the only audience that had ever mattered to him. Dean pushed himself gently away from the wall. Do you go to school? He asked. Eli shook his head. Not anymore. Do you have any family? Another shake. Dean looked down the quiet street. A car passed at the far end. Somewhere, a door closed. The world continued doing what it always did, unaware that something fragile and important was standing under a cafe awning. Trying not to break, you have a remarkable ear, Dean said suddenly. The way you held the melody back there, the way you listened while you sang, that's not something people teach easily. Eli blinked. I just sing it how it feels. Dean smiled faintly. That's the hardest way.
Ow.
He slipped a hand into his coat pocket, then seemed to remember it wasn't his coat anymore. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket and took out his wallet. He opened it, then closed it again without taking anything out. Eli said, if I asked you to trust me for a little while, would you? The question hung between them. Trust was not a small thing. Eli's chest tightened. Like, how long? He asked. Dean considered. Long enough for us to get you warm. Long enough for you to eat something that didn't come from a paper bag. Long enough for me to hear you sing again somewhere the wind can't interrupt. Eli hesitated. This was the moment where stories usually broke, where something went wrong, where hope made a fool of you. Why? He asked. Dean met his eyes. Because someone once listened to me when I didn't have much more than a voice either. And because I don't believe in hearing something real and walking away from it. Before Eli could answer, a sound cut through the quiet. A car door. Then another, voices low, urgent. Dean turned his head slightly. Two men stood near the corner they had come from. One held a phone. The other was speaking quickly, eyes fixed on Dean and the boy beside him. More people were gathering. Not a crowd yet, but the beginning of one. The street had followed them. Eli felt his stomach drop. He took a step back without realizing it. Dean noticed immediately. He turned fully toward him. Hey, he said softly. Look at me. I did. You didn't do anything wrong, Dean said. You sang, that's all. The men down the street began to move closer. A woman appeared behind them. Another phone rose. The quiet bubble was thinning. Eli's breath quickened. I don't like this part, he whispered. Dean placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Neither do I, he said, which is why we're not staying in it. He glanced toward the cafe door, then back to Eli. Would you like to come inside and finish that song? He asked. Just you and me?
Ellie
Hesitated, then nodded. Dean opened the door. Warmth spilled. Out light the soft clink of cups. The murmur of normal people living normal moments. Dean gestured him in first as Eli crossed the threshold. Still wrapped in Dean Martin's coat, guitar in hand, heart racing. He did not see the man across the street finish his call. He did not hear the words. Yes, it's really him. Did not know that by the time he sat down. This night would no longer belong only to a boy and a song, because the story had already left the sidewalk, and it was moving fast. The cafe door closed behind them with a soft sound that felt louder than it should have. It sealed the cold outside. It sealed the street. It sealed the moment when Eli had still been only a boy singing under a lamp. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of coffee and baked bread. A few customers sat scattered across small wooden tables, their conversations quiet, their movements slow. A barista looked up from the counter, ready to smile at another ordinary pair of late visitors then. Stopped not because of Dean Martin, because of the boy wrapped in his coat. Holding a guitar like something fragile he had just rescued from a fire, Dean guided Eli toward a corner table near the window, where the light was softer and the noise thinner. They sat. For a moment neither spoke. Eli's hands trembled slightly as warmth returned to them, that strange, painful tingling that followed long cold. Dean slid a mug of water toward him and waited until he drank. Only then did he speak. You did something brave tonight, Dean said. Eli shook his head faintly. I just sang. Dean leaned forward slightly. No, he said gently. You stayed. The words confused Eli. When the world gives you reasons to disappear, Dean continued, and you choose to let your voice be heard anyway, that's staying. Eli didn't know what to say to that. He stared into the cup as if it might answer for him. Outside the window, shapes were gathering. People, a few, then more. The reflection of phone screens flickered faintly against the glass. A low hum was building on the street. The night was beginning to realize what it had just brushed against. Dean noticed. He shifted his chair subtly, angling his body so Eli's back was to the window. "Before anyone else comes in here," Dean said, "I want to ask you something important." Eli looked up. "If tonight were only about a song," Dean said, "it would already be enough. But it doesn't feel like only a song. It feels like a door." Eli's fingers tightened around the mug. "Doors can be scary," Dean said. "They don't only open one way." The cafe door opened. A man stepped in. Then another. Whispers. Phones. The barista's eyes widened. Someone recognized Dean out loud. The room's temperature changed, not in degrees, but in attention. People were no longer drinking coffee. They were witnessing. Dean did not turn. His focus stayed on Eli. "I can't promise you a life without hard days," he said quietly. "I've never seen one, but I can promise you this. If you walk through that door with me, you won't have to do it alone." Eli's heart thudded so loudly he thought the room might hear it. "What? What door?" he asked. Dean took a breath. "I have a foundation," he said. "It helps young performers. Not to make them famous, to give them ground. Schooling, training, a place to sleep. People who don't disappear." Eli froze. "I'm not talking about contracts," Dean continued. "I'm not talking about stages. I'm talking about stability." The word felt strange in Eli's chest. "Would you let me help you find that?" Dean asked. Before Eli could answer, a woman approached their table. She was polite, apologetic. Her phone shook slightly in her hand. "Mr. Martin. I'm sorry. People outside. Reporters, I think." Dean nodded. "Double quotes, thank you," he said kindly. She stepped away. The hum outside the cafe had grown into something heavier. Headlights washed over the glass. The night had teeth now. Eli's breath came quicker. "I don't want to be on TV," he said suddenly. "I don't want them to." "Make it something." Dean's reply came without hesitation. Then, "It won't be," he said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He did not check messages. He did not look at notifications. He made one call. "Yes," he said calmly when it connected. "I need a car at the side entrance." "Now," he hung up. Then he looked back at Eli. "This doesn't belong to them," he said. "It belongs to you." The cafe door opened again, this time more urgently. A man with a microphone, another with a camera. Questions began forming in the air. Dean stood, not abruptly, decisively. He placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. "Come on," moved toward the back of the cafe, where a narrow hallway led past a storage room and out into a dim side lane. The owner, flustered and wide-eyed, held the door. Dean thanked him quietly. The door closed behind them, muting the voices. The alley was narrow, quiet. A different kind of cold lived here, but it was softer, waiting. A black car idled at the ep. Dean opened the door. Eli stopped. This was the edge, the place where stories became real or disappeared forever. "If I get in, I can't go back to the corner." Dean looked at him. "No," he said. "But you can go forward." Eli swallowed. "Will I still get to sing?" Dean smiled. "If you don't," he said, "something would be very wrong." Eli climbed into the car. Dean followed. The door closed. The engine hummed. And for the first time in many months, Eli was moving through the city without, needing to watch every passing face. They did not speak as the car pulled away. Outside, lights slid across the windows. The cafe, the crowd, the corner, the street lamp dot, all shrinking. Eli rested his forehead against the glass. "Do you think," he asked quietly, "my mom heard me tonight?" Dean did not answer immediately. Then he said, "I think she never stopped." The car turned and the street disappeared. 2 months later, a small theater filled with people who had come for music. Not headlines, not spectacle. Music. The stage was simple. A piano. A stool. Warm light. Dean Martin walked out to gentle applause. Then, he gestured toward the side. A boy followed. Cleaner. Healthier. Still. Then Dot, still quiet, still holding the same guitar. Eli Carter. Sat, the room hushed. Dean did not speak long. "Met someone on a street corner," he said, "and he reminded me why I started singing." Then he stepped back, and Eli began. The first notes were soft, but they did not tremble, because this time, the warmth did not come from a memory. It came from a future, when the moon hits your eye. Dean stood in the shadows, listening, not to himself, to a boy who had once sung into the cold and been heard, and now, for the first time, was singing into a life.